Hello and welcome to the latest IBAC podcast. IBAC is Victoria's anti-corruption agency and our role is to expose and prevent public sector corruption and police misconduct. My name is Alex Doran and I'm the manager of the communications team at IBAC. Today I'll be chatting with IBAC Deputy Commissioner David Wolf about the investigation process at IBAC from the time we receive a complaint or notification to the release of a report or prosecution. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here with you.
One of the key times the Victorian community might hear about IBAC, and often in the media, is when we've concluded an investigation and a special report has been tabled. Before it gets to this point though, a lot of work goes into the investigation itself. David, can you tell us a bit about how an investigation might come about?
Sure. The point you raise is really valid, that by the time people hear about our investigations, there is an enormous amount of work that has gone into the lead up to that. And it generally starts by us receiving a complaint via a number of channels into the organisation, and that in itself engages many parts of the organisation and quite a deal of work. So when IBAC receives a complaint, we have responsibility under our legislation to do one of three things with it. The first thing might be to dismiss it, so if it hasn't got basis or substance, then we can dismiss that complaint. We can refer it to another agency if there's someone more appropriate to investigate it, or we might investigate it ourselves. And there's a range of actions that we go through to get to that level. And one of the things that we might do with a complaint is conduct what we call a preliminary inquiry. And that's effectively to see whether the matter's got basis, so there's substance to it, and start looking at what evidence we might collect in that process.
When a preliminary inquiry is done and you feel that an investigation is warranted, can you tell us a bit about that process?
Indeed. So following a preliminary inquiry, which is effectively determined that there's substance to the allegations that have been raised and there might be some evidence that's been obtained in that process, IBAC will make a decision that we'll investigate the matter. Some of the things we might look at are the seriousness, the risk, the consequence, certainly whether it fits within our jurisdiction in the first place, and what the potential outcomes might be. And on that basis, we will initiate a full investigation.
As I understand it, the parameters of the work that IBAC does, particularly with an investigation, can be found in the IBAC Act. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how the IBAC Act frames IBAC's work.
So the IBAC Act, certainly as you said, sets out how we conduct our work, and it can sound a bit complex and technical, but if I can make it as simple as I possibly can. It sets out who can be investigated, what can be investigated, how an investigation can commence, how it can be conducted, so it sets out our powers and the tools that we might use in the course of that investigation, what happens if we have evidence of corruption or police misconduct, and then ultimately how we might report on that matter. So it sets those out in quite detail, and we're bound to follow that legislation.
Could you talk a little bit about the powers that IBAC has in the context of an investigation?
So as expected, an anti-corruption agency should and does have quite significant powers to conduct the investigation. Those powers are provided to us by the Parliament through our legislation, and as I said, they can be perceived to be quite intrusive, but as they should be, because we are investigating really serious matters. So we have powers to require people to provide us documentation. We have powers to search a place and seize documentation or articles, particularly if it's of an evidentiary nature. We have the powers to use surveillance devices and telephone intercepts. And one of our most significant powers is a requirement for a person to present and give evidence and ask questions when required to do so. And that's quite an extraordinary power in the context of investigative tools, and one that's used very responsibly.
At a high level, can you describe, the different phases of an investigation?
So we've just spoken about how a complaint might generate an investigation. When we get into the investigation space, there's effectively four main elements. The first part is scoping and planning. So that's when the team set out what they might be looking at, so the specific allegations, and then plan about how they're going to look into the issue, what evidentiary avenues they might explore and how they might attend to that. Then the next phase is actually executing that plan, so gathering the information, seeking it from all particular sources, and maybe using some of those powers I talked about earlier to gather that information. The next part is, once we bring all the information in, is the analysis and review, which again is a really painstaking piece of the process, and an element that we take really responsibly in terms of what we're looking at, how we gather it and how we record it. And then comes the last part of the investigation, which is the reporting. So preparing the material that sets out what we find and then telling the story of the investigation outcomes.
When an investigation is underway, as I understand it, there are generally two key phases, the covert and overt phases. Are you able to explain a little bit about what those two phases mean?
I just set out the four main elements of the investigation, and one thing I'd neglected to say was, depending on the nature of that matter, those elements might occur sequentially or concurrently, just depending on the nature of the issue we're investigating and the cycles in which they occur. When we've completed those phases, that's when we move into the reporting. Now, as you mentioned, two key ways we would describe our investigation. Firstly, the covert phase. So that's when we're conducting inquiries without public scrutiny, without notification of people that we might be looking into, or an understanding that we're actually looking into a matter. And that's really important because it allows us to gather information that's not tainted or that hasn't been affected by any parties by the time that we obtain the information, and allows us to get a real clear picture about what's occurring. And we might also deploy some of those evidence gathering techniques around telephone interception or surveillance devices in that phase. Once we switch to starting to talk to people or doing actions that are in the public space, like a search warrant or interviewing people, that's when we call it the overt phase. And that's when clearly there might be a greater understanding about what or who we're investigating. And that, of course, comes with a lot of challenges for us as well around how we manage the scrutiny of the investigation and potential people that might be involved.
David, could you talk a little bit about the time it takes to complete an investigation and why on occasion it may appear to be a long time, and why others actually sometimes are also done quite quickly?
That is one of the greatest challenges of operating in an anti-corruption space. Our investigations often take a long time. It might come as a surprise to many people that for us a year investigating seems to us like quite a short period of time. Sometimes our investigations reach out to 2 years in length. That's just the investigation phase, let alone the resolution phase, which might be the ultimate report. So unlike a TV show, it's not done and dusted in 47 minutes plus ads. It takes a lot of time, and that's because we have to be precise, we have to follow the rule of law, we have to ensure that natural justice and fairness has been provided to all witnesses and persons of interest, and that means that our processes and investigations can take an awful long time.
Yeah, that term natural justice, that gets used quite a bit at IBAC, but of course it's part of what we do, but I suspect a lot of the listening audience might not be familiar with it. Could you just talk a little bit about the natural justice process and what it means in the context of our investigations?
So natural justice is a really important element of what we do, particularly for our reporting phase of our investigations. So it's where we will have completed an investigation, we'll have written a report that contains the facts as we see them and the elements of the investigation. But before we move to any form of publication of that document, we provide it to the parties that are involved or named in the document to allow them the opportunity to respond to their particular element. And that's so that they can have an idea of how we've constructed the document and the evidence we have. And if they have any additional information or take issue with a particular element, that's their opportunity to provide us that commentary, and then it enables us to then assess their response and make sure that we use the information appropriately and depict it where need be in the final product. In effect, it makes sure that the final product is as accurate as possible.
And getting back to the original question around timeliness of investigations, IBAC has recently taken actions to improve the time it takes to undertake an investigation for certain complaints. I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that, please.
So we are always looking at ways to improve the timeliness. I mean, it's one of the biggest issues that comes up with anti-corruption commissions, and one of the biggest ones that causes concern, and that is the time it takes for us to investigate and finally report. So we're always looking on our usual process to see where we can improve. But specifically for police misconduct matters, we recently piloted a dedicated process and team to address single incident reports that were made by the community or individuals, and particularly a group which we called a high-risk group that might experience greater levels of police misconduct, which enabled us to assess those complaints, investigate those complaints where necessary, and provide outcomes in a far, far quicker time frame. So firstly, if I can focus on the group of people that we saw as having a heightened risk of police misconduct, that group included Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the LGBTIQA plus community, culturally and linguistically diverse community members, and people under age of 18 years, and also included those experiencing mental illness and people living with disability. So quite a broad collection of people, but people that have perhaps less of a voice when it comes to police misconduct. So it was important for us to really look at those complaints and see if we could provide a far better service.
That's really interesting information, David, about the Focus Police Complaints pilot. What was the outcome of the pilot?
Well, we had significant success. I've got to say this was one of the most important initiatives that I've seen at IBAC since I've been here. In the 6-month period, the pilot team assessed 94 complaints. So out of all of our complaint streams and information, they found 94 matters that needed additional assessment to see whether they needed that immediate investigation. And importantly, out of that, 24 police personal misconduct investigations were undertaken. That's a significantly higher rate than we ordinarily investigate, and we were able to by virtue of having this dedicated team that were far more responsive in response to these complaints. The investigations were completed with a range of outcomes. Many resulted in the allegations ultimately not being substantiated. Quite a number found issues in the course of the police interaction with this group that required observations to VicPol and to the complainants. And then some resulted in even more strident action around the discipline of police officers. Ultimately, we made a number of recommendations to Victoria Police, but I think the key thing for this organisation was that relationship with people who'd reported the incidents. We had a better relationship, a more open relationship with them, and their matter was looked at and dealt with in a far, far more expedient time frame.
Can you tell us what happens when an IBAC investigation finishes?
So in both our public sector corruption or police misconduct space, when IBAC finishes an investigation, we have that decision which is around, well, what's going to be the disposition of the matter. So in some circumstances, as I said, if we don't substantiate the allegations that are made, then we'll advise the parties, and effectively that's the end of it, and the broader public are unaware of it. And that's because, of course, out of fairness to the people we've been investigating, it'd be unfair to taint them with any insinuation they've been investigated. Then, of course, there's findings where there might be some improvements required to processes or policies, and we might make those private recommendations to organisations to improve what they're doing, perhaps to prevent corruption vulnerabilities in the future. We also have, I think we've spoken about those special reports, the publications, where we will actually set out in writing what's occurred in the investigation and detail the facts. Generally, those are done through the process of our special reports, which are tabled in Parliament and set out very clear details of what's occurred. And of course, we also have the option in some circumstances where we might prosecute an offence. That includes both police misconduct offences and, in some cases, some of our serious corruption offences.
You spoke about special reports. Does IBAC always publish special reports or reports after an investigation?
No, look, we don't. And it's, in some respects, it's just not possible to do so given the workload it takes and the justification to reach that threshold to report. So what I think you can take from my commentary is, though, when we do produce a report, it's generally a matter that has significant importance for the sector that we're reporting on, or for the system, or for the individual corrupt conduct that we might have identified. So it's really important to note that that is one of the more significant outcomes for the organisation, and one that we invest in heavily.
Would it be fair to say, in the absence of a prosecution, the special report can act as an exposure piece as well, and that it isn't something to be seen as lightly delivered by the organisation?
Look, I think that's a really important point. For a matter to give rise to a special report, as I said, is quite significant and quite serious. For a person to have their conduct exposed through that report is quite a significant outcome. Often we're asked after we've produced a report whether we're considering or going down a prosecution pathway. One of the things that we do in considering whether to have a report or prosecute or both is, well, what's the matter we're trying to expose? What's the effect of that exposure? How are we going to achieve that outcome? What's the best avenue to do so? Sometimes it is through a detailed special report, sometimes it is through a prosecution, and sometimes it is through both. But noting there's complexity if we're doing both, and often quite a lag period between the report, which is really important to tell the story first, and then the prosecutorial action, which can take some months down the track.
Well, David, thanks very much. It's been great to chat with you today. Thank you for listening, everyone. You can find out more about the details of both private and public investigations in our annual reports and special reports, and as part of our investigation summaries. To learn more, visit ibac.vic.gov.au. You can also subscribe to IBAC Insights, our online newsletter, by going to our website. In this newsletter, you'll find the latest news and events, a heads up on new reports, expert commentary, early research findings, and information on conferences and events.